Now that humanity has come together once again under the banner of fighting a common enemy, they have to prepare. Now that war is amongst them, they have to get ready. They don't know when the enemy will return. They know eventually they will. But for now, they must simply prepare. The humans, for the first time in a while, freely begin to share technology with each other, resources with each other. They upgrade and refit old ships, getting them ready for the fight. They construct new facilities to enhance their combat power. Multiple shipyards begin to be thrown together, though not haphazardly, no. Many of these are designed specifically for a certain type of ship. This is usually not done as it's not economically feasible to focus on one type, but now they do, scattered across all of human space. Along with that, training facilities are immediately erected for the massive amount of volunteers that are going to be flooding in. Agricultural plants are being pressed to their absolute limit as soon as they can. Along with that, multiple more processing plants begin to be erected before the harvest comes in. They must do this because an army runs on its stomach. Planetary defenses are also upgraded. Multiple dozens of satellites around each of Earth's habitable worlds and their satellites are brought up to bear. And with that comes the sudden burst of AI. Artificial intelligence is not something humanity as a whole wanted to be reliant on, although there were several planets that did rely much on the artificial intelligence just to make sure that they survived. However, now they were all relying on them to increase their lack of personnel. One might not think that the humans are outnumbered now that their numbers are higher in the tens of billions across planets. But when they look at the size of the other factions, well, they're definitely outnumbered. Humanoid drones are being constructed for the first time in decades, and they will aid in ground combat. Along with that, multiple vehicles are made to be able to function with and without AI, along with aircraft, exosuits, and weapons for their own personnel. Last but not least, medical ships, and a lot of medical ships. This war is not looking like it's going to be a quick and easy victory. As good as the fold system is, they can't just jump to a single core world and force them to surrender. The factions are spread out over such a vast area that they have to basically beat the enemy down slowly. They don't have any other choice. Humanity has to play this smart. They can't just haphazardly throw victims into the line of fire like the factions do. No, they have to use them to the best of their abilities. During this time, the front lines are constantly being reinforced. 21 different systems across the front lines are being built up. The warp drives that the faction use can't just sneak by. I mean, it's not a fold system. You can't just overpower the equipment and jump 2, 3, or 4 sectors at a time. No, that doesn't work that way. Warp is simply going very fast in whatever direction they're going, using some sort of gravimetric shielding to make sure whatever's in their way is out of the way. But that only works on something about the size of a comet. Anything bigger, and your ship is going to go splat, regardless of how large it is. The friendly Xenos in human space are completely oblivious of what is going on. They're not given as much news as the rest of humanity is, though they get bits and pieces. Though they get a full, detailed explanation as their own cruiser, the one warship that survived the failure of their faction, was brought back to them. This cruiser was completely redone, refit with much better weapons, though they don't truly match anything that a human frigate or destroyer would carry. This is due to the fact that even though they upgraded the warp engines, they just don't have the power output to operate human weaponry. The fold system was never implemented. This was a human secret. They realized that if the other side got a hold of the jump drives, the battle lines wouldn't be lines at all. It would just be some blur on the map. 7 months after the Empress ran off, the new one that is, The human assault fleet was finally ready for action. This came into 14 battleships, 51 cruiser class, 289 destroyer class, 489 frigates, and over 800 corvette class. This was a strange amalgamation of different planets with different technology levels, different abilities to bring all different weapons to bear. Most of the small colonies couldn't send battleships, but the core worlds could, and they did send what they could. The battle plan that they had laid out was simple. They would jump into the system, and as they advanced, they would offer the chance for the enemy to surrender. With this, they had to put in there was a time limit that would make sure that there was no stalling as they tried to get reinforcements in. The time limit would be one planetary rotation. Now, this is obviously different for every single planet, so they would simply put it that way. From the time they sent the communication, i.e., knowing when it got there, to the next planetary rotation, when that next building received it, is lined up, that is their time. If they do surrender at this time, they will send in their corvettes and frigates to secure the command staff, the approaching fleet, along with the planet itself. It would be a rather large operation, but definitely doable with a fleet of their size. If they refuse, ran out of time, or if they simply started to fire, well, the orders were quite simple. Strike first, strike hard, no mercy. The fleet lined up in formation and got ready for the jump. The jump had to be calculated as they would be somewhat close to each other. Jumping into another ship was excessively rare given the obscene expanses of space, something that should never be underestimated. However, it does happen on rare occasion. Very rare. When they jumped just inside the system itself, instead of being outside the system as they seen the warp of the enemy do. They see the enemy fleet around 2 different planets and 1 of the moons. There was no way of hiding the energy spike from a fold system, just like it's impossible to hide the signature of somebody warping in. It just doesn't happen. There's no stealth technology that can cover any of that, unless you're on the other side of a star or something like that. But the gravimetric disturbance for being that close would be difficult to deal with, to say the least. The mechanical message was immediately sent for their planets, their fleets, to stand down. As they did this, the enemy was already beginning to organize itself, and they began to retreat. Everyone was surprised. What are they retreating for? But then it realized they weren't retreating. They were consolidating. The message that was heard across the alien fleet and their planet was that demanding the surrender. However, being told that they would be treated well if they did surrender. As they looked over, they could see one of those gigantic command ships. Humans call it a Titan class, though they are exceptionally rare as there is really no reason to have one, at least for humans. But they saw it in lunar orbit, or what would be lunar orbit if that planet had a moon. And it was gaudy as hell. Painted all sorts of different symbols and colors, all sorts of banners hanging off it, all sorts of bulbous areas, most of which seemed like they were observation decks. It was odd. This thing looked like a floating turd in space. Everybody joked and said it was a flying cow patty, which most people didn't understand as they hadn't been on farms ever, but they got the idea, as this was some bullshit. Though the true bullshit was the defiant message that came back as the enemy combined their forces. The combined forces had lined themselves up fairly close to each other in a way to protect the command ship. While the enemy approaches, they continue to mock the humans. That is when a friendly cruiser warps in. The aliens themselves took a while to get there. A warp signature was seen very far out. They were actually sent prior to the jump itself, as the jump would quite literally leapfrog past them. But as the cruiser came in, they were simply given coordinates and got in position. moving with almost the same precision as the humans do. The enemy continued to talk all sorts of crap about how the humans are not showing their power. The commander, some strange-looking thing, nobody could figure out exactly what it was, stood there and said, "Look at how pathetic you are. No decorative on your ships at all. You don't even paint your ships. This is a show of true weakness. How could you possibly come and face us and demand surrender without some sort of decoration?" The admiral stood just as still and stoic as his predecessor as he looked into the 3D viewer. He responded, "Our ships are decorated. Decorated with the greatest type of ornaments possible. Lots and lots of guns." With this, he immediately cut the feed, as he had nothing else to say to the whatever in the hell he was talking to. The enemy, at that point, was about 1 minute out from the effective range of their version of main guns when they received a shock. Enemy battleships began to be pierced and exploded along with additional smaller ships. Numbers were very even between the humans and their opposing forces. However, humans definitely had the range advantage. Then, suddenly, a second volley came in, and the enemy fleet broke formation immediately, scaring themselves senseless, trying desperately to get away. Many of the ship captains told their helmsmen to turn and burn so hard that there was absolute chaos amongst them. The massive problems for the ships to maneuver safely cannot be underestimated. Many of the Xenos ended up smashing their own ships into others as they desperately tried to get away. Unlike the Xenos, a human formation is very spread out for this very reason. The enemy fleet is in full disarray at this point and cannot get any accurate shots off as human secondary batteries get into effective range. The word came down. Once you have a targeting solution, weapons free. And with that, they began to fire into everything. Every ship that didn't flee fired as well. They were 2 seconds after the humans in their firing. This meant that their range was almost the same, though the humans still held a slight range advantage, and no one can ever underestimate first hit. Human secondary batteries ripped through multiple lines of enemies while others tried desperately to back away. Point defense cannons took down most, if not all, of the enemy incoming fire. Other countermeasures like reflective chaff dealt with the rest. Humans coordinated volleys to make life hell and scared the living crap out of the Xenos. Wave after wave after wave of precision fire from the humans ripped apart line after line of the enemy fleet. Many of those watching the lines disappear in front tried desperately to fire and withdraw as fast as they could. However, if they weren't already on the run, they were in this fight to the end, and the end was coming for them. It wasn't much longer until the enemy command ship, which had fired many of its thrusters desperately trying to get itself away from the humans, was within range. One of the weapons officers yelled up, "Sir, I have a firing solution on the enemy command ship." The captain grabbed the comms and yelled in, "Ballistic cannons! Perforate that bitch!" With that, all the turrets that were ballistically charged lined up and fired into the command ship. The command ship ended up having more holes in it than a block of Swiss cheese. Aboard the enemy flagship, this different commander, this one more reptilian than insectoid, but still fat and no one could figure out what in the hell it actually was. It was freaking out as the staggering losses mounted. It wasn't long until they could see that those that put the planet to their back were not getting fired upon by the main guns. This gave them a chance. They moved closer to the main world. This left almost all the rest defenseless, as the only cannons strong enough to even reach out right now and touch the humans were that on the command ship itself. As the enemy retreated, those on the other planet and moon saw the human fleet coming close and immediately surrendered. They did not want any piece of that. Several frigates and corvettes were sent to secure them as soon as possible. Nobody needed their flanks compromised. However, they found out really quick that these were not going to give them any trouble. The enemy fleet was able to reform near the defense platforms. These were rather fragile, but they did pack a hell of a punch if you got too close. Less than half of their original numbers still remained, no battleships remained, and only about 20% of their cruisers. Destroyers, frigates, and corvettes was pretty much all they had left. The commander was shaking as his display shows the human fleet approaching. He hails the humans. I, I accept your proposal. Perhaps we can make a deal. As he held up his hand, showing some sort of scepter or something like that. The humans recognized this. This was to show that he had a noble house. His scepter itself was in the shape of a J, oddly enough, curling back up under the forearm. It looked very weird, very decorative, very gaudy, very stupid. The Admiral got on the comms, and again with a straight face, "Too late for deals. Surrender." The enemy commander scoffs at the idea of total surrender. He then orders his ships to charge once the humans get within range of the stations. The stations, not needing to move, had some pretty decent weapons, which would be very, very short range compared to the battleship's main guns. However, the tertiary turrets, they were just about the same. This meant they had an opportunity. This commander was no idiot, and he realized this was probably his only way out. He had already tried to get a warp going, but unfortunately, the ship wouldn't go. He was far too close to the planets and had to clear them, or else the magnetic interference would just make things impossible, usually ripping a ship into about, 10 billion pieces. Following their orders, the enemies charged straight towards the cannons from the platforms as the platforms began to fire everything they had, burning up any ammunition they had in a matter of moments and then using their energy projectors to try and take down any human ship that was there. The command of the humans simply looked, and one of their ensigns that had been watching simply uttered, "Ballsy." Stupid, but ballsy. As soon as the enemy got within range of the tertiary weapons, the enemy was torn apart. But they did deal some damage. Damage was down in the single digits as far as percentages because the damage control teams did exactly what they were trained to do. Only one ship actually went adrift, but was able to get underway within less than an hour. This was a great hat tip to those who had done all their training to make sure space combat would go in the way of the humans. Now that they controlled the space around the one remaining planet in the system that was still defiant, they still had one more thing to do. They called in the hospital fleet. The hospital fleet blinked in just a few moments later, and along with several frigates, destroyers, and corvettes, they went through the entire battlefield and cleaned out any survivors that was there, along with salvaging any tech and any intel, of course. But that was not their job. Their job was to save as many lives as possible. The ships themselves were loaded with slaves. Slaves, though trained to do one job on the ship, they were basically used as organic computers to operate the machines, and that's all. They knew nothing else except for pain and discipline and fear. That was all. Those who had to deal with the slaves always felt sad, but always had a deep sense of rage, and this rage permeated through the entire fleet. Down on the surface, the planetary governor was told to surrender. He no longer had control of the space. "You won't fire on a planet full of innocents." He says this while showing a large room of slaves, all of different species, all of which racked in chains and held down to the ground so tightly that most of them couldn't move, many of them covered in their own filth, all of them looking emaciated, looking as though they were about to keel over any moment. And though this made the entire fleet itching for a fight, itching something fierce, the Admiral remained in stoic condition as he said, "We don't have to," and once again cut the line. He immediately turned to the captain and made a general call to all of them. Tell those athletic alcoholics I would prefer the governor alive, but dead is just as good. With that, everybody knew what was about to happen. The destroyers, frigates, and corvettes began to get into position above the capital. The destroyers' main job was to give cover from anyone coming up to try and take any sort of pot shots at the corvettes and frigates that were coming through. Precision shots were rather common, especially through the ventral cannons. These were very powerful, but very, very well designed to make sure they could pick off an atmospheric aircraft from orbit, though they had to be in mid-range orbit to do that. The frigates immediately began to launch their drones as air cover. Most drones are designed more for aerospace than anything else, though they can maneuver like a damn missile. They're not very large, and they simply flew out like a bunch of angry wasps that somebody had just pissed on their nest. Before the actual launch of the pods, decoys were sent out right before the pods. These would send out a huge radar signature and absorb any targeting system. They would make sure nothing could pull away. Along with that, a whole bunch of reflective chaff was sent down along with flares, most of which would go deep into the atmosphere before bursting. This would be enough to protect the pods, because right behind that, the pods were launched. The corvettes, once they launched their pods, if they have any, were turned down and went straight to the surface right behind the pods themselves. The pods could go a hell of a lot faster into the atmosphere than the corvettes, but that didn't bother anyone. The pods, once they got through the outer atmosphere, were glowing red hot and simply burst out the outer layer. The molten slag of those immediately thermal cracked and usually exploded, leaving a whole bunch of more debris that any type of ground fire was going to hit. The pods, once they got close, popped their chutes and would land with 4 soldiers inside each. Each side would burst open, firing forward at about 20 meters, and then crash into whatever the hell was in front of them. Armored bipeds would step out, usually taking down anything that looked as a threat. Each of them covered in ceramic and metal armor, able to move absolutely gracefully, yet still had multiple weapons on them, some that fired many rounds very quickly, others that seemed to fire one round that just didn't seem to stop. Others carried explosives that seemed to simply go boop, and everyone waited and waited and waited. Then all of a sudden something would explode. They were absolutely horrified at this. Those on the ground that fought seemed to shoot at them, but it seemed as though all it did was slow them down. They just wouldn't stop. They continued to push out more and more and more, and they didn't realize what was going on. What was the haste of these bipedals as they just ran through, busted through, swinging their weapons when they got too close, striking them in the head, sending them flying. What the hell? And then they realized as the corvettes came down, landing in one hell of a haste. They immediately dropped the ramp, and armor, artillery, and other vehicles began pouring out, along with those with heavy, heavy armor. This was what they were doing. They were making a landing zone. They made sure that the corvettes could land and drop the heavy equipment. Once they did, they would do the same thing they did on the way down, which is provide limited air support. They used all the guns on the outside, their point defense cannons, to take down any aerial assets that weren't friendly. They also began to fire on anything on the ground that might be dangerous. Any type of armor, any type of artillery, anything that deemed a threat was completely blasted. The capital itself, the main focus of the humans' attack, was overrun in 2 hours. Everyone was amazed. Everyone looked at their watch. Less than 2 hours. Holy shit. The enemy was absolutely shocked at the speed of the attackers. Even though they had cleared the landing zone, they just didn't stop. Once they had more weapons and armor behind them, it seemed as though they pushed even further. The amount of firepower that they were wielding was absolutely horrifying to everyone. Most of the Xenos would simply either fight with their natural weapons, whether that be claws, blades, hooves, tails, spikes, horns, you name it, or they would have one type of energy projectile weapon. That's it. They didn't have much else. There was no need for it. Planetary invasions were so rare, no one really gave a crap. The efficiency of taking out buildings, clearing streets, and even going through sewers just staggered everyone. They couldn't believe there was no place to hide. A few of the enemies had actually tried to consolidate and hold an area, and then found themselves under the boot, literally, of this giant biped that seemed to not give a shit. If they raised a weapon, that boot would come down and crush their head, forcing all the rest of them to drop to their knees, drop their weapons, raise whatever appendage they could and surrender, and immediately shit themselves. All this being done from whatever they were. The Xenos couldn't see anything but mechanical overlays of something, whether it be some sort of vehicle rumbling down the road, an aircraft or drone whipping through the sky, or these bipedals covered in metal. They didn't even know what they were, but they were seemingly impossible to kill. The governor, who was hiding inside his own personal bunker in the center of the city, gave up without a fight. As soon as the door was kicked open, well, slammed into and knocked down, actually, the governor simply stood up, walked forward, with his arms out to the side, in a form of surrender. And once that battle was over, the entire planet surrendered. Medical frigates were immediately called in, and they made their way down to the surface. Supply frigates were not far behind them, and on them, the engineers, because there was a lot of work to do. They had decimated the major city on the planet. There wasn't much there to begin with. Soldiers on the ground could see the condition of the oppressed personnel and seemed to have absolutely no chill at all. A few former slave masters might have just happened to find themselves left in a room with a bunch of newly freed slaves that now hold weapons. Some would call that poetic justice, but this was one of the things that would just be a cliff note in the history books. Those newly freed slaves suddenly tried to claim humans as their new masters. The bipedals would simply look, turn, and walk away. Those inside could hear the speakers from the ships claiming that everyone that needed food, water, medical attention should show up. They had set up with the corvettes and frigates a hasty mash unit of sorts, along with engineering areas, an area where they could get food, clean water, anything they actually needed. The slaves themselves came over and started to gorge themselves, a few to the point where they actually vomited, but then just kept eating. They were informed in their own language through the speakers to slow down as their bodies were not used to this much nutrients. Simply slow down, there is plenty of food for everyone. As these bipedal robots seemed to wave the slaves free after ripping off their collars, many of the owners claimed that they had the divine right to these slaves and that the new humans had no reason to take them away. They were holding religious texts while refusing to stop abusing any slave that was close by. And they would do this even more so. It was a younger one that seemed to be right next to their feet. Due to this, a very famous photo was taken. One of these mechanical bipeds had simply walked up, got down on one knee, and started to treat the slave that had been stepped on, kicked, abused in ways that no one wanted to know by this slave master, while another biped reached over and one-handed grabbed this thing by its very bulbous and very small throat and wrapped its digits around there and raised it up very high and squeezed slowly as the slave master was reaching for the digits, trying desperately to pull them apart, but to no avail. It was said that those around could hear the servos winding as the hands slowly squeezed the life out of the slave master, and eventually they could hear all the internal parts of his neck cracking and popping as the life drained from his eyes. Nobody minded this, but around the entire capital this scene would play out as the slave masters kept trying to make a deal or trying to hold the slaves back, trying to say that they had the power over this. No one can take them away. That arid world would become moist for once as the blood of the faction members was spilled across the entire city. If they pissed off anybody, if they talked out of line, if they even thought for a moment that they held any bit of authority, the lightest they would get was a balled up pile of digits that would be rocked across their face. At worst, they would be slowly crushed underfoot, as several times it was noted that these bipedals would kick them over, knock them down, hold them down with one foot, and while the Xeno fought to get free, it would extend the blade out from its arm and slowly eviscerate it in front of all, letting its entrails slide out and spill on the ground. This was usually not enough to kill it right away, but the screams would reach out to everybody, and they would all watch as this former slave master, preferably one in high standing inside the faction, very slowly and very painfully died. Aside from this, the slaves that were found on this planet were found to be more human-like than anybody would have expected. Well, at least more humanoid than they expected. As it turned out, as they started to check out all the different hard drives, or what the Xeno called hard drives, they would find out that the more human looking that a slave was, the more expensive it was. And to have these was to show how proud you were, how wealthy you were, how high up in status you were. This made many of those inside the ships want to vomit, roll their eyes, and punch something all at the same time. What made it worse is that the smoother the skin, the more they were used for pleasure than work. Though most of the ones used for pleasure were clearly female, and mostly the males were used for hard labor. Labor so much that when they did find a labor camp, almost all of them were on death's doorstep, as they were so emaciated, bruised, broken, many of them gangrenous at this point, that everyone was just trying to keep them alive as much as possible. They even upped 2 different frigates for this one area, just to bring enough medical supplies to save as many as possible. As good as human technology is, there's only so much they can do. And with every loss of those that they had just saved, humanity's anger grows. Around the planet, if they weren't indigenous species, they were removed. This definitely included any of the faction members, though the majority of them were already pushing up daisies. Those that remained were taken away rather abruptly and not tenderly either. Humanity had to figure out exactly who this planet originally belonged to, what was the indigenous species, and once they do, they need to help them rebuild. This would mean that they need to bring some sort of irrigation so that they could grow crops. They need to build infrastructure so they could move the food and water around to everyone there. To this end, the volunteer fleet was asked to show up. The volunteer fleet was just that, a whole bunch of civilians wanting desperately to help. These were non-combat personnel who just wanted to go into a different world and see what they could do to aid those that had been totally decimated by war. This confused the locals, as they saw all these for the first time, humans that didn't wear much except a small respirator on their mouth. They were absolutely amazed at this, as each of these humans would come in, use a translator, of course, to talk to them, but seem to have absolutely no malice. How can something so dangerous be so caring? They didn't understand this. Yet many of the humans would say, that's just human duality. Locals didn't understand it, but honestly didn't care now that they had their planet back. They wanted to rebuild, they wanted to become their own again. The remaining locals, who included those that had been liberated from other planets, and of course the original fleet that showed up inside human space, actually totaled a pretty good amount. 81,006 was the total count that they had, more than enough to start over. This planet would be able to survive just fine with just a little bit of help. As all this was happening, the second assault fleet had jumped into a neighboring system. They followed the same doctrine of demanding surrender, and to absolutely no one's surprise, the enemy told them to pound sand, and the enemy fleet had no survivors. The planet was then surrounded and it surrendered immediately once its own fleet was gone, which meant there was no drop, there was no fight. Recovery efforts immediately began. The command of the faction was taken completely intact. Seeing that this was a jungle world, it's going to heal itself for the most part. It hadn't been strip mined or anything like that, as the topography made it very difficult to do that. Apparently, the faction wanted to turn it in some sort of vacation spot so they didn't tear it apart all that bad. The indigenous population, although was only at 1,200, or a little bit above it, as it turns out, being an amphibious species meant that they needed special treatment to become slaves, which made them very poor slaves. Since they were not considered good slaves, many of them were simply hunted down, which is why there were so few left. A grand total of 3 villages were found, one of which only had 4 personnel in it, all of them children. This, again, irritated humanity. Back in human space, they all watched video, images, projections of what everybody had done on the other planets. Cheers, celebrations, just a whole bunch of jubilation was going on as they saw that they were able to punch through the Xenos and make them pay for being such assholes. This seemed to renew the sense of purpose in humanity as everybody seemed to work even harder, desperate to get as much into the war effort as possible. One man stood looking out on a new shipyard that was being constructed. The shipmaster smiled as he thinks of the better ships that he can make, better ships that he can send out, better ships that people are going to buy, better ships that is going to hopefully end this conflict very quickly to stop these Xeno assholes from being just that. But that is not what he had motivation for. As he looked out into the shipyard, he heard the cries of his wife and children behind him. As he reached down, picked up his young daughter, and looked into the eyes of his teenage son, while his wife gave him a hug, he thought to himself, this is what humanity fights for. We don't fight because we hate what's in front of us. We want to protect what's behind us. He again turned and looked at the shipyard with this thought. Was it worth going to war? He once again looks at his children. Yeah, this is worth protecting.